Today's guest is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who's covered everything from politics to rock bands to the beautiful, sweet science of boxing. His latest book, Blood and Hate, the untold story of Marvelous Marvin Hagler's battle for glory, isn't just a sports biography. It's a raw, unflinching look at a man who fought for respect both in and outside the ring, and some say the most underappreciated champion of his era. The author, David Wedge, joins us now on the show. David, how are you?
Good. How's it going, man? How you been?
Good, buddy. Let me start off right out of the gate here. You've covered the gamut here, from politics to sports and everything in between, rock bands, and some say boxing is kind of like the world of rock and roll in the behind the scenes. Why Marvin Hagler and why boxing for your next book?
Well, I grew up in Brockton, and that's where I'm from, and I grew up under the legend of Marvin Hagler and Rocky Marciano. Everyone that grew up in Brockton has some connection to one of the fighters or both. In my case, it's both. My dad, who's no longer with us, was Rocky Marciano's paperboy when they were little kids, and he took me to Marvin's fights when I was a kid. So the first professional boxing match I ever saw was 1980, Marvelous Marvin Hagler title defense against Vito Antuofermo at the Boston Garden. And it kind of stuck with me my whole life. And as I became a journalist and then later an author, it was, kind of my white whale. This was kind of a real passion project that I always wanted to pursue. I don't feel like Marvin ever got his proper due in books and anywhere else, really. So that was kind of my driving force here and why I wanted to do it.
Now, you say you had a connection there. Was he relatively approachable in the Boston area, Brockton?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's been the fun thing with this book. I've been doing tons of signings, and everyone that comes up has a story. Oh, I met Marvin here and I met Marvin there. I've been doing a lot of signings down on Cape Cod because he trained famously down in Provincetown in the off season. He called it prison. It was, dead of winter. There was no internet back then, no work from home. So Provincetown was just a summer tourist town. So the off season, it was vacant. So there's a great Provincetown story with Marvin, and going down there for these Cape Cod signings, countless people coming up to me saying, hey, I remember I used to go watch him train and see him running in the dunes, or I saw him at this restaurant, and then certainly in Brockton, he was very accessible, especially early in his career, until, once he became the champ, he kind of, became a little more secluded, but he was always, in my opinion, a man of the people.
Well, when you strip away like the Hall of Fame career, the knockout reels and everything that he's done, when you were doing this research for him, what surprised you the most? Not that you didn't know about everything, but is there something that you didn't know about but that got past in the public, in his public image, that wasn't really what it was?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, and again, I grew up here, so in Brockton, and I thought I knew everything about Marvin Hagler. I read every article ever written about him, but as I started to, I was young, so I probably missed a lot of stuff, but, for our generation, as I started to piece together his life story, I realized what an incredible life story he has. I knew that he had been born in Newark, New Jersey, and then moved to Brockton, but I thought he moved when he was much younger. I didn't realize he lived in Newark till he was 15. And that's a big part of my book is, how his family escaped out of Newark, which was in really disarray at the time. The city was involved in some of the worst rioting the country's ever seen. And, the story of Marvin and his family moving out of Newark is a really captivating one. In addition, I really didn't understand until I wrote this book, the timeline of Rocky Marciano's death and when Marvin moved to Brockton. And that timeline lines up pretty serendipitously, where Rocky died in August of 1969. And that's right around the time that Marvin's family moved to Brockton. And the Petronelli brothers, who were great friends with Rocky Marciano, Marvin's trainers, Goody and Pat Petronelli, they were going to be opening a gym with Rocky Marciano when he died in the plane crash. So after he died, they had no idea what they were going to do. And lo and behold, Marvelous Marvin Hagler walked into their gym.
And now you write in your book about the Newark riots, and I want to touch back a little bit on that, because I think that what it does is, how much do you think that growing up in that chaos, because it was utter chaos in those years. Now, I don't remember them, but I read about it, and in your book, you distinctly talk about it. Do you think that his upbringing in that environment alone, or was it just his hunger that got him into the bigger picture in boxing?
Well, look, you're a student of the game, so you know that every one of these great champions has something that drove them, right? Every one of them has a story. Some of them are just great athletes, and I think Marvin falls into that category. He was just a great athlete. I think he would have been great at anything he ever attempted to do. But he was a shorter guy, so he wasn't playing basketball. And he wasn't the biggest guy, so he wasn't playing football. And I do think he had a chip on his shoulder because of the way he grew up. He was very distrustful of authority, especially white authority, because in Newark, New Jersey at that time, it was really racially segregated, much worse than any time in history. And the only white people that he knew were cops and politicians and teachers and authority figures, and they didn't treat him and his family very well. So his Black experience in Newark was one that really, I wouldn't say made him an angry man, but it put him on his guard and made him realize that he was his only way out. He couldn't rely on someone else. So when he arrived in Brockton at age 15 and wanders into the Petronelli brothers gym, he didn't trust Goody and Pat Petronelli for a long time, but he learned from them, and they built an incredible loyalty and an incredible friendship. And that's really when Marvin started to become a great fighter.
Right. And you dig in a little bit, and it's kind of shoehorns back into this, how the boxing system was always rigged. I mean, it might not be on that level now because of everything that's going on. And you see how the Petronelli brothers helped him navigate through that, and they kind of took him in as one of theirs. If Marvin Hagler was fighting in today's boxing world with social media and instant viral moments that he's had, does he rise faster, or do you think the system still stonewalls him?
No, I think he would have risen a lot faster because every knockout would have been would have gone viral. And the things that happened, for example, the 1977 Don King Tournament of Champions on ABC that descended into ridiculous scandal and fraud, where there was literally guys that were in there that were ranked above Marvin that hadn't fought in 10 years. That stuff wouldn't have happened because, the internet would have blown up all those things immediately and caught the fraud, and it never would have even happened. And I also think that, Marvin was pretty good on his feet with the media. He wasn't, Sugar Ray Leonard, he wasn't Muhammad Ali, but he had a quiet sort of authority about him, where when you talk to Marvin and you watch his interviews, he's confident, but he's not cocky. He's assertive, but he's not a jerk. And I think that, I kind of compare it to Bill Belichick a little bit in a way where he was kind of all business, you know what I mean? But he had some funny one-liners, which is the same as Belichick. Belichick made the media laugh quite frequently, but he was also very, if you didn't want to talk about it, he wasn't talking about it. Marvin was kind of the same way.
Now, do you ever compare him? If you ever sit back and look at today's fighters, I have one in mind. But do you ever compare him to a fighter of today that you would say, man, that guy is a Hagler cloth, cut right from that Hagler cloth? Is there one that comes into your mind in particular?
Well, I want to hear yours because you're certainly more up on the modern fight game more than I am. But, certainly in the more recent years, not currently fighting, but Bernard Hopkins, similar type of fighter. I also would say that, I don't think he's anywhere near Hagler's level, but Crawford, is certainly a tough dude that, Marvin, I would love to see Marvin fight some of these guys. I think he would dispose of most of them. Like, I think he would beat Bernard Hopkins, and that's not a slight on Bernard Hopkins. That's like saying, I don't know, Babe Ruth could hit more home runs than Aaron Judge. It's like you're talking about the greatest of all time. Right. In my opinion, Marvin is right there in the top one or two greatest middleweights of all time. A lot of the old timers will tell me Monzon. I never saw Monzon fight. I was, too young. Well, who do you think? I want to hear this.
I'm going to get killed in the comments. I know when I say this, I get killed all the time.
I'm going to get killed.
So here's my theory on this one. Hagler reminds me, today, David Benavidez reminds me of Hagler. High risk, little reward. And not to say that David isn't on that superstar level, because right now there really is no superstar. Canelo's fading. Crawford doesn't have that. Crawford does not have that superstar status that most people think he does. He is not as well known as people think he is. People know Jake Paul more than they know Terrence Crawford. Let's think about that. Put that on a scale. So he's a guy that reminds me of him because Hagler, you did not want to fight him because he's going to be he's going to be in shape. That's number one.
Yeah.
He's going to be tough. He could take a good punch and he's going to keep coming. If you can't get something off of him, it's a long night and it could be bad. So one of the reasons why I think Canelo does not want to fight him, but there's not enough coming back. So if I was going to fight him, give me 20 mil, I'll fight him. Okay. They're not giving 20 mil anymore. They're not, unless Turkey Al-Rashid comes in and says, I'm giving you 100 million. It's not worth it. So I think that guy kind of, David Benavidez in that way does it. And it's similar in that way. And could he have been a bigger superstar if he would have fought Canelo? Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
But it perfectly segues into Hagler and how he is. There's talk of a movie going to be made of Hagler's story.
Yeah.
And if you were in charge of that, from your book, would you fight to keep him exactly how he was in there, or would you kind of make him a little more Hollywood?
Well, I'm involved in this project. So
Are you?
Yes. So so I'm working with Sam Rockwell and Rosie Perez, who control the rights to my book. That's how the whole project got off the ground. Was they bought, they optioned the rights to the book. So we're working with some filmmakers now. We're trying to get it trying to get it moving. Hollywood's a crazy place. I've dealt with it many times. The story that we're going to tell is as you know from my book, is Marvin's origin story. It's not the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. It's not Roberto Duran. It's not Tommy Hearns. It's him getting out of Newark, fighting, moving to Brockton, rising up the ranks and fighting all that corruption and winning the Minter fight. That's the story that I tell in the book, and that's the movie vision as it stands now. Obviously, another filmmaker comes in, could change that anytime they want. But I think, the beautiful thing about it and why, someone like Sam Rockwell, an Academy Award winner, wants to tell this story is because Marvin is a pretty unique character, and you don't have to change him and turn him into something he's not. As I said, he's not Sugar Ray Leonard. He's not Muhammad Ali. You don't have to make him that. He's a guy who struggled on his own for a long time and chose his own path. But it's also a beautiful story of loyalty and trust with the Petronelli brothers. And it's a story of a man literally fought racism in England against Alan Minter, which was, in my opinion, the most disgraceful moment, certainly in boxing, if not in all of sports.
Was there anything that stuck out that gave you chills from that night? Because that was actually that was one of I remember seeing that. Now, I wasn't there, but I mean, I'd seen it on video when I was watching and doing some research here. That was wild.
I think it's another reason why I wrote this book, because when I was thinking about how to tell Marvin's story, I didn't want to just write a, Wikipedia page. Here's who Marvin was and here's what he did. I'm telling a story, and the story is about that picture where Goody, Pat, his brother Robbie, some of the other folks in his entourage are shielding him from those bottles being thrown by racists in that crowd in England. I remember it when I was a little kid. I was little, so it didn't have the impact on me. But I feel like the younger generation below us, and the millennials and the Gen Zs and they're not going to believe their eyes when they see what happened with this fight, and that first of all, that people had bottles in an arena. And the reason why they don't anymore is because of this. And I just think it's such a shocking moment. And certainly writing the book, I got to interview Bob Arum, people like that. And Bob told me about how him and Howard Cosell were sitting there ringside and they dove under the ring for protection themselves. His bottles were smashing all over the place. Cinematically, doesn't get much better than that. Yeah. And you know what I found very strange when reading about Hagler and his relationship with the Petronelli brothers. Boston and Brockton, they're not, the Boston Celtics and the Boston Bruins. How do I say it? The racism is very strong there. So to have that bond with a fighter, a white guy, two white brothers, and Marvin, who didn't like, to be honest with you, didn't like the white race at that point because the way he was treated. Right. That had to be a dynamic, when you were doing the research, to find that dynamic bond that they had. Did you find it to be one of these things where it's a once in a lifetime thing from someone from that era, and they're coming into meeting someone that he thought, oh my God, these guys are gonna treat me like I'm their son? What did you find out about that dynamic? Well, I think, circumstances often dictate destiny with people, and Marvin fell into a place, and I tell the story in the book about how Marvin walked into that gym that day where, he goes to a housing project and gets into a fight with a fighter, a guy named Dornell Wigfall, who kicks the shit out of him. And the next day, Marvin says, that's not going to happen to me again. He walks into the Petronelli brothers gym. He was looking for something. The Petronelli brothers were also looking for something because they just lost their friend, Rocky Marciano. Another interesting piece of this, George, is that, the Petronelli brothers were Italian, World War II vets. Their family was from Italy. The most racist people that Marvin dealt with in Newark was mostly Italians. A lot of those cops that were involved in those riots that were shooting people and hurting people were Italians.
Right.
So there's a long history there. It's been explored in Spike Lee's movies, the Italians versus the blacks and that sort of thing. So there's an extra layer of distrust there, and it took a long time for that to break down. But I think it just broke down because of the business of boxing and the science of the sport, where the repetition, Goody, the trainer, coming from that military background, Marvin looking for that sort of regiment in his life that he didn't have. His life was chaos. But the one thing he could control was that gym and that ring. And he trusted Goody. And it took a long time. So I think they went on that journey against racism together. They were very protective of each other. Certainly Don King tried to steal Marvin Hagler away from the Petronelli brothers. And Marvin got very offended by that because he did look at them as family. And they certainly looked at him as family.
Did you have any reservations diving into that part of the book?
Look, I'm a white guy, so I'm not going to try to explain the black experience, but I'm from Brockton, and I certainly know the streets of Brockton as good as anybody. And to me, it's a really unique place where I grew up. Brockton, it's when I was a kid, it was very racially mixed. It was, I had, my high school was, half minority, half white. It's now more heavily minority. It's more probably, 85, 90% non-white now. But when I was there, and this was when Marvin was fighting, it was a place for equality, and you had to earn your keep, and you had to fight to protect yourself no matter what color you were. And frankly, I didn't see a lot of racism in high school and in Brockton where I grew up, because I think everyone had mutual respect for each other. If someone was a jerk, they were a jerk. It wasn't they were a jerk because they were white, or they weren't a jerk because they were black. They were just a jerk. And that's kind of the way it went. And I think that's the city Marvin grew up in. Petronelli brothers certainly respected that same sort of attitude. And I think he grew to as well. Marvin, that was the thing with this. I think the reason the story was never told until this book is because Marvin never talked about it. He never played up the race thing. The elephant in the room here, George, Alan Minter, before that fight, said in a press conference, no black man will ever take my title. Marvin didn't run around telling everyone, I'm going to kill that white son of a bitch. Like, he just, okay, he's talking trash, he's going to pay. Even after the bottles rained down after that fight, Marvin didn't focus on the race. He focused on the fact that he won the title and finally got what was his and blah, blah, blah. He downplayed it all. But to me, there is a bigger story there, and that's what I dive into in the book, because Marvin didn't really want to.
Now Marvin talks about this. Doesn't in the book he'll talk about this, or you'll get into it in the book. It obviously didn't talk to you directly about it, but he famously walked away from boxing, and he did it on his own terms. That was the one thing that I always respected him for. And I met him at the Hall of Fame when the year he got in. I think it was the year he got in, and he walked away from boxing.
I think, right? 93.
Oh, then it wouldn't have been that. No, I got it. You know what? I seen him there. And so they were celebrating him for some reason. Yep. He was there. And what struck me about him is he was kind of standoffish. It didn't really get involved with the boxers much. And Bob Arum was there. Didn't really talk much to him. Camacho was there, but he was wild. He walked away on his own terms. And in a day like we just saw Manny Pacquiao come back and for reasons, again, I get killed because I say he's coming back for money. I believe he is. I strongly believe he is. But he did it on his own terms. Became a celebrity in Italy. He was on a soap opera. Did many other things. What can boxers and entrepreneurs and creative minds do and learn from the way he exited sport?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And if I write a sequel, a follow-up, I'll definitely dive into it because it is interesting. Marvin, left, in my opinion, he left at the top. He lost that decision to Sugar Ray Leonard, but that'll be debated forever. I don't think he lost the fight. I think at worst it was a draw, and Marvin.
Well, let me ask you on that point. You said he left at the top. Do you not think he had more?
Oh no, I do,
Okay.
but I think that he could, I think had he fought Sugar Ray Leonard again, I think he would have beat him pretty easily. I also think that Marvin had, a lot of other people that were waiting to fight him, after that fight. So, I just think that he was one of these people that did not, he didn't burn out slowly. He didn't keep coming back and, like Evander Holyfield, or even Tyson now with Jake Paul, So
Yeah.
but as a Brocktonian, it was frustrating because we all knew Marvin could have a rematch and beat him, that's how we all felt. And certainly all his, his entourage and his friends. But I think what happened was after that fight, he was so disgusted. And again, I write about it in the book. That was the third major decision in his career that he feels that he was robbed on. The first one being Boogaloo Watts back in Philly. The second being the Vito Antuofermo, the first fight, where Marvin thought he won. And a lot of people would agree. Bob Arum thought he won. But Vito got that decision. And then this one, along that route of those three decisions, he wins 50-something fights, 60 fights. And he sees all the corruption with these tournaments and Don King and all this stuff, and these other people making more money than him. So when he loses that decision to Sugar Ray Leonard, I think that he was just finished. He was finished fighting physically. I think he was finished fighting the system, and he wanted a different life. And frankly, when he moved to Italy, he didn't come back for many, many years, at least publicly, because I just think he didn't want to talk about it and deal with it anymore.
Well, it's funny you bring up the Marvin Hagler was stringing off that 50-some fight win streak before he gets a title fight. And this is something that I'm just going to pop in here. I didn't realize this question off the top of my head here. Right now, boxing is going through a transition period. Turkey Al-Sheikh, TKO organization are kind of taking over boxing. They're making what are called UBOs, Unified Boxing Organizations, where they make the rules, they make the belts, they make the rankings and whatever. That is eerily like why the United States government stepped into boxing, because they decided who would fight when, and it's why Marvin Hagler did not get a shot at the title quicker than he did. What is your thoughts on that as to where we're heading now with that formula? And if you don't know the details of it, I respect that. But it's the same, almost get the same feel I get as we're doing this now, and here we are, some years later.
Yeah, look, I mean, money talks in every sport, right? I mean, you've seen it with the WNBA right now. Teams are selling for record numbers because their ratings are up and all that. And I think, the boxing industry is seeing the money that's in UFC, and they're trying to figure out how, seeing it in golf, you got a new golf organization. So I don't know all the details of this, but certainly what I do know is that boxing, more than most sports, is ripe for corruption because there's a judge involved. There's judging. Most sports don't have that. Most sports either score or you don't, or you get the ball in the hole or you don't. But in boxing, there is a subjective element to it. It's also, no secret that there's been a lot of organized crime around boxing over the years, and a lot of boxers are tough guys, and they don't come from the most, reputable background sometimes. And there's a lot of bad people that will latch onto them. So when you have that, there's going to be people that are going to try to find ways to make money, cheat, lie, steal. I think it's important for the government to have a role in regulation and make sure that, especially with the gambling, that people aren't, getting ripped off. But it's tough. It's really tough. But I think, the people who know the sport the best know who the best are. And those are the people that should be making these rankings. And whoever that is, wherever they are, someone needs to keep an eye on them. I guess that's the way of saying it,
Yeah. Well, when people read this book, Blood and Hate, what's the one thing you hope they carry with them out of this? Whether they're a fight fan or they've never even watched a boxing match in their whole entire life, what do you want them to take out of this book?
It's a great question. I think that, just the life of a man that endured so much on his own without a dad and found his own way through this very difficult, challenging world of the fight game, and built this beautiful friendship with the Petronelli brothers that they became father figures and he became a son figure, and then finally gets his chance at a title, and it's against a guy backed by horrible, horrible racists. And he walks into a very hostile environment and wins, and then gets assaulted and a riot breaks out. And I think that story and all the emotions behind that and the way Marvin was able to negotiate that and come out a stronger person is a great message today. I think it's a great message for everybody to look at that photo and say, that photo is the result of hate, but Marvin didn't cave into that hate. He didn't become a hateful person after that. And he didn't get his belt that night. He had to wait 3 weeks until he got his belt, and it was mailed back to him in Brockton. But then they had a huge parade for him in Brockton, and he became the biggest boxing celebrity of that era, really, until Mike Tyson. So that the message is really resilience. That's the message.
Well, it's certainly, you definitely came off in that book with this. It definitely came off that way in the book. And, but it just wasn't, it didn't just tell his story. It made you feel the fight that he was in, his loneliness, but also his pride. He had a lot of pride. He kept to himself, but he had a lot of pride in what he was doing. And that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think also, let's not forget, he was representing the city. He did represent Brockton, and Brockton's a tough town with not a lot going for it at times. And, he is under the shadow of Rocky Marciano as well, who arguably one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, 49-0. And everywhere he went, those old time, well, Rocky, Rocky, he heard that his whole career. But he didn't let that define him either. Marvin defined himself. And you're right. He had incredible pride. He had incredible determination. And what I learned writing this book was that, no one was more committed to the gym and to making himself the absolute best. He told himself, the judges might take it away from me, but I'm not going to blow it. And that was kind of how he lived. And there's a great line before the Minter fight. He sees a writer from the Boston Herald, a guy named George Kimball. I mentioned this in the book. And George was a friend of mine. I knew George. I worked with him at the Boston Herald. And George says to Marvin, he's talking about the bad decision that he got in the Antifermo fight. He goes, hey, Marvin, what do you think of what about the judges here? You afraid of the judges? And Marvin said, I brought my own judges. And he held up both fists. And I think that defines Marvin.
That was Marvin Hagler. Well, for everyone listening, Blood and Hate is out now everywhere books are sold. Get it, read it, and remember what it takes to go from nothing to a champion like Marvin Hagler did. David Wedge, thank you for your time. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Where can they find you on social media?
Find me on Instagram is probably the best place, at David M. Wedge. And if you're on Twitter, at Dave Wedge, but I use Instagram more.
All right. Well, David, it's great to have you on. It's an honor. We will get the book out to you. David Wedge, thanks for joining us, buddy.
Thanks, man. Take care.